English Gals Talk Poetry. I'm your host, Emily O'Brien, and today I'm joined by Ashlyn Donahoe and Gabby Messina.
Hi.
We are all English majors, and we are here to discuss the 1891 to 1892 version of Walt Whitman's poem, Icing the Body Electric. Throughout his career, Walt Whitman made it his goal to become the American poet, the one to encompass all of American life and experience within his work. Because of this, many credit him as America's representative poet, bestowing names such as the American Bard upon him. But was Whitman's work truly an accurate representation of the diversity present in 19th century America? To answer that question, we're going to take a look at how Whitman represents men and women in Icing the Body Electric, and see if those depictions are actually as egalitarian and accurate as Whitman might have intended them to be. So the poem starts focusing on the differences between men and women in section 5, when it starts describing the female form. So let's begin there. What did you guys think of this section?
Well, I think I really started by comparing it to, like, the other section that also does the male form, and I think the thing about this one is he predominantly focuses on aspects of the female form that are typically sexualized. Like, there's a line where he says, hairs, bosom, hips, bend of legs, and those are all areas of the body that do get sexualized a lot, whereas when he's describing men in his other section, he talks about much more general parts of the body and just appreciating all of it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's really coupled by the end of section 5, when they have the line, she's to conceive daughters as well as sons, and sons as well as daughters. And it shows that, like, her whole purpose as a woman is to give birth and to procreate. And it just shows that women weren't valued as highly as men because they're just there for procreation.
Yeah, like in section 6, which mostly talks about, like, the male form as kind of contrasted against the female form, there definitely isn't as much focus on, like, the male physical form as there is in section 5, which describes the female form.
I think the other thing about section 6 is that there's so much more available to men. He says, like, he has action and power, pride is for him, knowledge becomes him, but you don't see those same opportunities laid out for women. It's just like she is both passive and active, which is much less good. That's not a good word. Much less beneficial than, like, knowledge and power. It's like women just have to be these passive figures that are there to procreate.
I was going to say that describing the man and his capabilities, there's also jobs being attributed to him. Mm-hmm. And I feel that where we speak about women, where he speaks about women, it's more of what their body can do. They're really not spoken in terms of, like, other ways that they can be beneficial. It's just, like, they are here for being a mother. Mm-hmm. and what makes them good mothers, whereas men, it's like what makes them good workers, what makes them good people, what makes them, just different and better in his eyes, I think.
Okay. Because, like, motherhood in and of itself kind of depends a lot on the physical body, at least motherhood the way that, like, people in Whitman's time understood it. It was very dependent on having a womb and then having that womb expand and then giving birth and, like, caring for a child. Whereas, like, with a lot of men's roles, you need to be able-bodied for the most part, for the labor aspects. But, like, other aspects, like being a friend or being a good person or, like, a noble American, we're kind of less dependent on, like, the body side of things, but more kind of dependent on the soul of the person.
I would say conversely to that, women's job of being, like, a good wife or, like, a good caretaker depends on their soul, not their body. Mm-hmm. Whereas, like, but he's still putting so much focus on what a woman looks like, whereas what a man looks like is not nearly as important.
I'm fascinated by this phrase in section 5 saying, be not ashamed women. Mm-hmm. And even though he is telling them to not be ashamed, it's the assumption that there would be shame for them after hearing what he's saying about them. I just find that really interesting that he's anticipating shame from the women and not from the men.
I feel like he's mansplaining women's roles, where he's just like, I'm going to objectify you, but don't be upset.
Yeah.
I'm like, can you not?
Yeah. And I think that idea of like mansplaining kind of gets at the crux of the issue here, in which Whitman is trying to represent America and all of Americans while being kind of stagnant from the position of a white male. Like, if he maybe consulted with people who weren't white or with women to help construct his poetry, maybe that wouldn't be the case. But from what we know of Whitman and how he kind of wrote and constructed his poetry, we don't really know much about him consulting with other people. And the other interesting thing kind of based around that is we do gotta recall the original version of this poem was originally published in 1855, a time when, you know, the representations of women weren't that positive. And I'm sure that a lot of women did feel shame because of like the roles they occupied or because of their position in society. And interestingly enough, like a good number of female writers of Whitman's time critiqued his work, like in newspapers. They published reviews, and most of them were very positive. They were very pleased with his representation of women, and if they had any concerns with his poetry, it was mostly kind of surrounding his kind of explicit language and his very physical descriptions. They weren't concerned about like what he was describing or how he was presenting people. It was more like the level of detail he was describing, like their bare bodies and different areas that were kind of sexually stigmatized.
I think that ties into the idea of historicizing what you're reading. Again, something we talked about last time, and then talk about it this time, is that we need to remember at what time period this is being written and what the expectations are. And I'm sure Whitman is being extremely inclusive with just including women in general. I think we need to remember when it was written and just how probably far ahead this was for them.
I mean, yeah, definitely. Like, if you're looking at through the point of view of like it was made then, yes, it was very progressive for women at the time, but also this is a poem that's still taught to high schoolers today, and it's, you could also say like, what are people taking away from it today? Is this something that we're still valuing in our society? I mean, yes, we can value it as a historic work, but shouldn't necessarily be taught like this is what poetry has to be, when it clearly shows very sexist aspects.
And I think that, like, you know, when it is taught in class and when it is taught today, people do acknowledge, like, that, you know, these representations aren't completely accurate and that they aren't really indicative of what women are and what women are capable of being. But I think it just kind of allows people to learn how to have these types of discussions. So that's section 5.
Mm-hmm.
What about section 6? Is there anything else in there that you guys didn't get the chance to discuss in relating to section 5? Or
I do like the phrase, the opening sentence, or opening phrase, pardon. The male is not less the soul nor more, he is too in his place. And I just thought that was kind of a fun little thing to read. Be like, the man is in his place.
Yeah.
But he too is in his place, because the woman has her place, and it's in the bedroom.
That's a good point.
Well, what this kind of reminds me of, and you guys both also studied this in our core courses, but, you know, the great chain of being, which Whitman's very much interested in, like, the cosmos and the universe and how everything is kind of situated within that great cycle, which is very reminiscent of the great chain of being, in which every person, every animal, every aspect of creation has its particular role in place in which it is most well suited and is created to perform and fulfill that function. So things being in their place and being as they should is very much part of what Whitman is interested in investigating and exploring in his poetry.
I think it's kind of like a beautiful concept, but then you have to think about like the time period, and women's place was in the home. So in him trying to say that everything is in this great chain of being and everything has its place, he's really just reaffirming sexist ideals that are perpetuated through society, whether he intends to or not.
Another thing I'd like to point out in section 6, going back to the idea of him being, I'm going to forget the word that you're phrasing. Can you phrase it again?
The representative poet?
The representative poet, thank you. Is where he says, is it one of the dull-faced immigrants just landed on the wharf? Where he's representing immigrants, but still calling them dull-faced. And so it is great, it's an idea that everybody is sacred, man's, woman's, meanest of the labor's gang, an immigrant just landing on the wharf. But it's always just like a slighted representation. Like, yes, he is representing women, he is representing men, he is representing all these bodies as these holy kind of things, but it's still a slighted respect. It's still, it's not perfect.
Yeah. Speaking of imperfection and kind of the representation of laborers and people of the lower class, let's move on to sections 7 and 8, just because they kind of provide an opportunity to directly compare and contrast the ways that Whitman represents the male body, the male soul, the male way of being, as opposed to the female body and soul, in comparing these two slaves at auction, one man and one woman.
The most upsetting line for me in this entire poem comes in the beginning of section 8, when he says, "She is the bearer of them that shall grow up to be mates to the mothers." Wait, no, that's not the line. I lied. It's earlier than that. Well, I guess, no, I'll still go with that line. "She is the bearer of them that shall grow up to be mates to mothers," because it's still, like, showing that, like, she's just there for birthing, and, like, the women who will marry her sons are just there to be more mothers. And it's just perpetuating this, like, position of women where they have no other option, and this is, like, their only job. It's that you have children so that your children have children.
I think it's interesting when you also put that with the line in section 7, "This is not only one man, this is the father of those who shall be fathers in their turns." So it's interesting that the man gets to be the father, where the mother gets to be the mother of those who are also going to be mothers, and the mother of those who are going to be mates. And so, he is important in and of himself. Like, he is important. He's an important father because he is a father, where she's an important mother because look at what she's giving.
Yeah. I would also like to say the line you just pointed out is followed by, "In him the start of a populous state and rich republics." It's showing that, like, men become part of society and part of government and culture, and they get to be part of the, quote, rich republics. But women, they don't get that kind of follow-up. They just get to be mothers.
It's interesting to me that you guys pointed out this section in section 8 in particular, because that section is one of the few areas in which this poem was modified throughout the various revisions that it went through from 1855 to 1891 to 1892. So the original of that section doesn't end with "she's the bearer of them that shall grow and be mates to the mothers." It continues to say, "Her daughters or their daughters' daughters, who knows who shall mate with them? Who knows through the centuries what heroes may come from them? In them and of them natal love, in them the divine mystery, the same old beautiful mystery." So I'm curious, like, what do you guys think of that addition and then it getting taken out?
I feel like that addition is really just expanding upon his point. Because it says, like, I don't remember exactly what he said about them being able to, like, bear future heroes or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, they don't get to be heroes. They just get to have sons that get to go on to be heroes.
Get to begot the heroes.
Yeah. So it still just is just reaffirming their position as they get to be mothers and proud of their children and nothing else.
And also, I feel like mothers may be creating children, but fathers seem to be able to get to be the creators in a sense. Like, the fathers get that prideful word of creation and creators, where women just, like, make it.
Fathers get to shape their children, whereas mothers just bear them.
Yeah, I feel like there's this glory given to men when women are doing most of the job.
Where do you guys see that kind of extra credit being given to men?
I feel like if we go back to the line we mentioned earlier, where it says, "This is not only one man, this is the father of those who shall be fathers in their turn, in him the start of a populous state of rich republics, of him countless immortal lives will be countless embodiments of enjoyment." So showing that, like, with fatherhood comes shaping countries and lives and happiness, and like you get to if you're a father, you get to have that influence over your child to shape who they will be and how they will shape the world. Where if you're a mother, it's just you're the mother of mothers. You keep having kids.
And I know we're not really focusing on Section 3, but I feel like in The Farmer, you get that sort of pride in creating beings where women, it's more of an expectation, where fathers, it's an accomplishment.
Okay. I mean, now that you've moved on to Section 3, I can open the floor again for your guys' observations on just the rest of the poem. Like, so far we've been focusing on just sections 5 through 8, but the whole poem is about, you know, presenting bodies and presenting people as Whitman would like to see them be represented. So where are some other instances in which you kind of see that representation of the genders that strikes you in the rest of the poem?
Yeah, I would like to pick up first. I was just kind of thinking, you know, in terms of, okay, him being a representative poet, just small things that I'm noticing in just, you know, rhetoric in itself. It's always man and then woman. So like just in Section 2, I love the body of man or woman, where male comes first, and it does that again. That of the male is perfect, and then that of the female is perfect. I just think rhetorically, it's always the men get to be described first, the men are acknowledged first, and then women are always acknowledged second.
Okay, so like in the order that they're being presented,
Yeah.
It kind of like implicitly places women as secondary to men.
Yeah, there's a line that I'm looking for where he's describing a row of people, and I'm not think I'm going to be able to find it. Maybe we could pass off to Gabby.
Yeah, going off of like the greater representation of men, I'm really just looking at Section 3, because Section 3 is all about that farmer, and you don't really get a counterpart to it of like a female who's in charge and gets, or not even in charge, but just like a representation of like one woman for a whole section. And also the representation of men and women in this. It talks so much about his sons and grandsons and all that they do together, but his daughters don't really come into it. It says they and his daughters loved him, but that's about it. You just know that his daughters love him because he's a father and he's the man. But his sons get to fish and hunt, and you definitely see that like men get represented far more in the poem, which really just adds to the problem of representation.
Yeah, I really I'm fascinated by the idea of him being called representative poet, because even though I'm sure he was great for his time, looking now and it being taught now, I feel like it's very obvious what he's missing at this point, especially just beyond men and women. But like I said, I think I brought up the immigrant. I feel like I keep coming back to that idea of, I feel like he's trying to praise everyone's bodies and yet still has to call the immigrant dull-faced.
Yeah. I feel like there's a lot you could read into that line, because he is describing like an immigrant just coming off the boat. Yes. I don't think he's saying dull-faced as in they're like ugly, but maybe like
I'm saying
haggard.
I read it as less knowledgeable, like not like unlearned, dim. Yes. And I find that interesting that with a compliment, it's backhanded in a way.
Okay, so like based on our discussion we've been having, and like based on the areas of the poem that we pointed out, we can conclude that Whitman cannot be America's representative poet. While he might have had like noble intentions, the fact is that he was not well informed enough on the experiences and feelings of women to accurately represent them in his work. And there have been many other discussions on Whitman concerning his presentation of different races and nationalities, like we were talking about earlier with the immigrants. There's a very extensive ongoing conversation about Whitman's representation of, you know, non-white Americans and people who aren't American born or didn't emigrate from Europe. But I feel like that by simply showing the discrepancies in his presentation of gender, we've done enough to prove that he's ill-equipped to be America's representative poet. But then again, that begs the question, if Whitman can't be America's representative poet, can anyone?
No. So Sorry, I feel like this is just a huge issue we have in America today, especially with like white writers definitely writing on behalf of people who are queer, people of color, and it's definitely come up as a major issue. But the problem is like everyone has such an individualized experience, and no matter who you are, you can't encompass all of the experiences of other people. And even if you like do heavy interviews with someone else and you like try to fully capture what they felt, like you still don't have like a full understanding of what they've been through, and it's impossible to encompass every single person
in one person.
It's never going to happen.
I was thinking there might be a representative anthology before there's a representative poem.
Yeah. Oh yeah, anthology. Yes, because I feel like even then though, like you still have there's
a nuance that you'll never achieve.
I was gonna say like if you can represent a group accurately, you're never going to represent every single individual person within that group.
Yeah. I think that's so interesting because, like, one of Whitman's most famous lines is the line, "I contain multitudes." And he's constantly making the point that his soul and his very being is enough to very much contain everything that, you know, the universe has to offer. And while we would discuss that there's a very, like, romantic and kind of noble intention with the realities of the world we live in, like, there are discrepancies between the experience of how a man perceives the world and how a woman perceives the world based on the way that society perceives and treats them. And because of that, I'm sure different people coming from different areas of privilege perceive the experience of other people with like varying degrees of privilege very differently.
Yeah, that line about Whitman containing multitudes is exactly what I'd expect a successful white guy to say.
I feel like it comes down to the nuance of difference between a sympathetic writer and an empathetic writer. It's being able to understand someone versus having been there and feeling it themselves, I think is really where this whole idea of a representative writer comes down to.
All right. Well, that's it for today's episode of English Gals Talk Poetry. Once again, I'm your host, Emily O'Brien, and I've been joined by Gabby Messina.
Hello.
And Ashley Donegal.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for listening, and have a lovely day.